Hello, everyone. My name is James J. Britton from the Department of Sociology at Cade University across the pond in Nova Scotia, Canada. And I am delighted to chair this June event for the Marxism Disability Network. So today's proceedings under the title Disablement in the Socialist World provide a powerful review of three examples of contemporary research being done through the MDN. So before we begin, I would like to provide a brief outline of the event and how the evening is going to proceed. So there's going to be three presentations with each speaker being given 15 minutes to comment on their work. After each of these presentations, there will be a 1-minute break, which will allow everyone the opportunity to take a short breather. We can reset and prepare for the subsequent speaker. After the final presenter of the three, we will proceed with a short 5-minute pause, followed by a fruitful question and answer between the audience and the presenters. So prior to beginning, we would like to let everyone in the audience know the outline of the event itself. So first of all, everyone, this is going to be recorded. If you wish not to appear on screen, please be sure to turn off your camera. Also, there's a closed caption option for those in attendance if desired. At the bottom of the screen, under the More option, one can find the necessary support. So please feel free to click on that. With this brief outline of the event's format, I am happy to introduce our three speakers in the order of presentation. Luke Beesley teaches within the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester and is a doctoral candidate within the Center for Applied Philosophy, Politics, and Ethics at the University of Brighton. Luke's work reconstructs Marxist theory developed in historical disabled people's movement and applies these contemporary political and philosophical debates. He is a fellow of the UK's Association of Higher Education and a qualified archivist. Bertold Scharf studied social and economic history in Munich and Hamburg and completed their doctorate at the University of Kiel. Their dissertation research, soon to be published in a book in German, focused on the working environments of people with disabilities in the German Democratic Republic. Now a research assistant at the Institute for Digital Participation at Hochschule City University of Applied Sciences, Bertold is a board member of Disability Studies Deutschland. Currently, they are involved in 2 research projects on digital accessibility and participatory research with peoples with disabilities. Their presentation is centered on disabled performance, problematizations of work and disability in the GDR. And Shu Wan is a doctoral student in history at the University of Buffalo. Aside from being an active host of the New Books Network, Shu has an impressive publication record in the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy, Historical Studies in the Natural Sciences, and the Review of Disability Studies, to name a few. They will be delivering a presentation entitled Making the Deaf Useful: The Policies of Deafness in 1950s China. So with these introductions complete, I am again pleased to welcome you all to this June event of the Marxism Disability Network entitled Disablement in the Socialist World. I'll now pass things over to our first presenter, Luke Beesley, followed by Bertold, and then Shu.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. Really appreciate it. I am just sharing my screen, and hopefully you should see me enter the slideshow roughly now. Fantastic. So my presentation today covers one particular instance of international exchange between Marxists and Socialists in disabled people's movements around the world. Namely, I will be looking at a research tour of Havana in socialist Cuba, undertaken by a delegation from the British Disabled People's Movement, most of whom were members of the Union for Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or UPIAS, that was conducted in the early part of 1985. This tour was hosted by the Asociacion Cubana de Limitados Fisicos Motores, or the Association of Motor Impaired Cubans, ACLFIM, which was a national DPO in Cuba who were recognized by the Cuban government as the legitimate representative of physically impaired people on the island. A report of the delegation's findings was eventually published in 1987, but appears to have been out of print for around 30 to 35 years. To the best of my knowledge, tonight is the first public statement of these findings or investigation of them in at least 25 years, very possibly longer. And I know one of the authors is in the audience, so no pressure. The report is part an analysis of Cuba, an empirical analysis, and in part a reflection of the theoretical implications of the Cuban experience for global analyses of disablement. Now, as some of you may have cottoned on from my pronunciation of ACLFIM's name, I am not a Spanish speaker, let alone am I a scholar of Cuba. So I'm going to be focusing here on the analytical and conceptual aspects of the British delegation's findings, rather than trying to adjudicate as to whether their reading of the Cuban situation was in fact true. I simply do not have the language skills to arbitrate those claims. So if we're looking at the conceptual findings of the tour, we need to look at what assumptions, what views the British delegation entered into it with. We've talked about this in other MDM sessions, so I'm going to skate over it very quickly here. The British delegation, or at least the vast majority of them, believed that disablement is a socially constructed category involving the imposition of restrictions, exclusion, and segregation onto people with functionally different bodies, and that this imposition arose from the central contradiction of capitalism, namely the contradiction between use value and exchange value, particularly the use and exchange value of labor power. A thumbnail sketch of their theoretical commitments were that once people with physical impairments or other impairments are excluded in whole or in part from the production process due to the demands of surplus value extraction, then you end up with a particular strata of the working class who are incapable of managing their own social reproduction independently through the wage fund. The state then empowers a separate social strata, usually taking the forms of charities, the medical profession, what have you, to manage this group of people's social reproduction for them, dominating them in the process. And in return for undertaking this task, the charitable professional strata is allocated social rents. Finally, the kind of interpersonal oppressions that we face, discrimination, bigotry, paternalism, so on and so forth, are a downstream result of this enforced passivity. So the Cuban comrades in ACLFIM were able to make a case to the British delegation that socialist construction had transformed all of the three core areas of the disability social relationship. Firstly, it had dealt with the root of the contradiction. ACLFIM members stressed that Cuba's economy was not run on the basis of surplus value production, but rather sought to create the use values needed by, firstly, the Cuban population, and secondly, by projects of national construction that Cuba was involved in. So there was no underlying need within the model of accumulation for anyone in particular to be excluded from the labor process. Secondly, the ACLFIM members pointed out that where there were specialist disability services within Cuba, they were not run by a separate social caste. They were rather democratized and devolved either to disabled people themselves directly or to society as a whole. So DPOs like ACLFIM and their sister organizations of blind and deaf people handled things like vocational education, the casework element of trade union work, and accessible transport aids and housing. Where there were forms of disability provision which were not provided directly by DPOs, they were handled by the mass organizations of Cuban socialism. So, for example, if you needed to arrange personal support services or some minor adaptations to your home, these would be sorted out through either the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, grassroots mass organizations organized at the neighborhood level, or Popular Power, which were municipal organizations, again, grassroots. insofar as disabled people took part in these organizations at roughly the same rate as they occurred in the population, so roughly proportional to their share of population, there was no structural divide between those who receive services and those who administer and run them. And finally, the ACLFIM comrades pointed to the proactive role of the Cuban state in tackling interpersonal bigotry, prejudice, and what have you. The Cuban government and the Cuban party was enlightened and recognized that you cannot build a strong solidaristic society while continuing to exclude 10 to 20% of the population. They wanted to harness the labor, the creative potential, and the insights of disabled Cubans, and they would step in coercively to get in the way of anyone whose views, bigotry, or personal hang-ups was preventing the integration and the harnessing of these energies for the socialist project. And ACLFIM comrades could point to some very real gains that arose from socialist construction. So institutionalization and segregated schooling had been more or less completely eliminated for physically impaired people, while this had been the rule prior to the revolution. Aids were scarce for reasons that we'll get onto shortly, but they were distributed pretty equitably, and DPOs had an absolute veto over the commissioning of aids by the ministries of health, education, or employment, right? They could step in and say, we don't want this kind of aid, it's not helpful, you need to go and do something else. They could also point to rising levels of employment for physically and sensorially impaired people, and therefore to rising levels of economic independence. Furthermore, ACLFIM could state, and where this was accepted by the British delegation, the rights question, at least in the sense that we understand it as Marxists, was solved. There continued to be social contradictions. There was no claim that there was no disabling social processes in Cuba, but the Cuban state was very clearly attempting to administer these in the interests of the oppressed, as opposed to in the interests of those who are already privileged by the preceding order. And ACLFIM could point to multiple occasions where either the Communist Party or the Cuban government at ministerial level had stepped in to demote or circumvent prejudiced decision makers in other parts of society. The source of remaining restrictions were, ACLFIM argued, twofold. Internationally, they were the effects of imperialism and the effects of the blockade. But domestically, they were not rooted in the kind of antagonistic contradiction which UPIAS members were familiar with from Britain, but instead in a non-antagonistic backwardness of views. There were some members of Cuban society whose social attitudes had not caught up with the revolution. And the job of disabled people's organizations and also of society more generally was to educate them into a more enlightened and inclusive position. So the British delegation, and particularly UPIAS members, accepted the meat of these arguments. They didn't think that the Cuban socialists were kind of feeding them a line. However, they believed that there were forms of disability oppression in Cuba, which the argument made by ACLFIM could not account for. So firstly, they pointed to limits of the kinds of people who were now being mobilized and integrated by disability politics. They granted that very real gains had been made and fought for by blind people, deaf people, and people with sensory impairments. However, noted that this was not the case for people with learning difficulties. Those who were neurodiverse or had learning difficulties of another kind tended to be institutionalized at a rate that was comparable to the pre-revolutionary period. And certainly their treatment lagged behind the most progressive trends within the bourgeois nations. Similarly, there were forms of exclusion and segregation within ACLFIM and its sister organizations practice themselves. So ACLFIM's own activity tended to remain segregated at the point of delivery. It ran separate and segregated transport services. Its vocational education was not fully integrated into Cuba's education system, and often the employment that it got people into and represented people in remained disabled-only workshops. There was also an element of spatial segregation. ACLFIM distributed accessible housing, so it matched tenants with houses that would meet their access needs. However, the majority of adapted housing existed in remote rural areas with very little social infrastructure or access to a wide choice of employment. This led the British delegation to a very serious question. Were the roots of these continued forms of disablement, which were being reproduced daily in Cuba, entirely in the process of imperialism? Or, in fact, was disablement being reproduced by strategic choices that were made by disabled socialists in Cuba? The British delegation took very seriously the claim that imperialism was a dominant factor in continuing disablement on the island. They pointed to structural conditions which were set up entirely by imperialist projects, which set real material limits on the kinds of integrative practice which could be undertaken. So the blockade imposed on Cuba by the US limited the island's access to building materials and electronics necessary for adapting housing and providing aids, but also to technical and scientific literature from which Cuban scientists and technicians could design their own version of aids, getting around the need to import them. This was clearly crucial in Britain. We know the delegation noted the increase in disabled people's independence had been directly linked to technical advances which were being denied to Cuba. Similarly, the island was under direct threat, both military and financial, and was required to divert labour and resources into both building its defensive capacities and into repaying debt so that there was not financial leverage over it by unfriendly governments. Insofar as these resources were not available for application to social programs or to increasing industrial development, this too set the conditions for disablement to continue. So imperialism had set Cuban socialists a very difficult task. How do you build an egalitarian project which includes the oppressed on the basis, in the face of imperialist meddling and other forms of pressure? This task, the British delegation believed, required a full conceptualization and a strategic response. What they found instead was that disabled socialists in Cuba had acted more or less spontaneously and had subsumed their own politics into broader problems of socialist construction. The Cuban government and Cuban disabled activists had recognized that socialism would be untenable if it remained exclusive, and saw the need to mobilize the disabled population to increase national capacity, including them in the military forces, in economic life, and in other forms of social life to build up the island's ability to resist imperialist pressure. However, they had approached these problems pragmatically and without a theoretical basis. Mobilization had become primary and its form had become secondary. If it was more efficient to mobilize disabled people in forms which were segregated rather than integrated, both the main arms of Cuban socialism, the Communist Party, Popular Power, and the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, and its disability-specific arms had recognized these as acceptable, as certainly better than they had been before, and had not insisted on the need to fundamentally desegregate disability provision as they built up the mobilizing capacity of the population. This led the British delegation to be concerned that disabled Cubans were setting themselves difficult problems further down the line. Once segregated services had been established, building on the British experience, they argued dismantling them would become a secondary struggle, just as difficult as building the mobilizations in the first place. So having criticized the Cuban comrades for their spontaneity and their lack of a theoretical basis, it's only fair to end by stating that the Cuban experience led the British delegation to refine slightly their own definition of disablement. Firstly, they scoped their claims. Their analysis of an antagonistic contradiction between those who provide services and those who receive them was limited to application only in the advanced capitalist world and the imperialist world, where we can talk of such things as a social management case and a welfare state which supports them. The antagonism was no longer thought to be an essential component of any disability relationship, but a qualitative reflection of the market forces which engendered this particular manifestation of it. So antagonisms around domination were seen as being a direct reflection of the form of commodity exchange dominant in capitalist societies, and the periodic crises of the social management of disabled people were seen as conditioned by the crisis tendencies of capital in their secular movement. Globally, however, the definition of disablement needed to become more capacious in order to take into account occasions where you did not have directly capitalist inputs, however, you had a reproduction of restriction, exclusion, and segregation. So the global definition of disability to apply anywhere was reformulated as quote, a social relationship between those excluded from participation in the economic and social life of society, and, on the other hand, the social superstructure which exists to service the dependency this creates, close quote. The main theoretical implication of this is that even though the disability relationship is in the first instance caused by the capitalist mode of accumulation, it can survive past the dismantling of capitalism at least the level of the national unit. And we need to be aware to the fact that socialist construction itself can, in different forms, reproduce relations of disablement. So finally, there's just my bibliography. As I said, this report, this pamphlet, has been out of print probably for around 30, maybe 35 years. We have 2 copies of it at the Disabled People's Archive in Manchester. I do have a digital copy, unfortunately unadapted, that I can send to anyone who might be interested. Thanks so much for your time.
That was wonderful, Luke. Thank you very much. And with that, we will go to our second presenter, Bertold.
Thank you very much. Okay. Throughout the 20th century, work was considered the most important driver for the integration of disabled people into society in Germany. Social policy was heavily focused on this area, and if success had to be measured by contemporary parameters, it would be based on the criterion of integration into work. In the GDR, German Democratic Republic, today East Germany, the employment of disabled people was repeatedly addressed, providing interesting insights for disability history. This presentation is based on my results of my dissertation. In the following, I will first situate my approach within the research landscape, and then I will present a brief overview of Marxist traditions in the GDR concerning disability and performance. Finally, I would like to focus in particular on performance expectations and the impact on pay. As I mentioned, work had a central position in the GDR. This insight is by no means new. Sociologist Martin Kohli has already emphasized that the GDR was a working society, in German Arbeitsgesellschaft. At the same time, Kohli also asserted that the GDR was not a meritocracy, Leistungsgesellschaft. While a significant part of life took place in the workplace, performance played a subordinate role, said Kohli. Although the leadership of the SED, Socialist Unity Party of Germany, repeatedly emphasized the willingness to perform, Kohli claimed that there was a little pressure for efficiency and businesses hoarded labor workforce. While this point is largely uncontested, I would like to demonstrate in my presentation that for disabled people, lower performance could indeed have significant consequences, at least in terms of remuneration. I see the DDR as productivist welfare dictatorship, that being driven by performance. When I speak of disability, I refer to a phenomenon that arises from societal attributions. Disability is understood in German society following Anne Waldschmidt as a social problem. Here, a problem is considered a social phenomenon that fundamentally subsumes, quotation, undesired conditions and situations, quotation ends. Often, the identification of such a phenomenon is associated with naming groups of people who require assistance. An indication that disability is seen as a social problem is that there are institutions and administrative and legal categories that deal with and define it. Disability becomes the subject of ways of problematization, a term coined by Michel Foucault, which generalizes the question of why particular problems are addressed in a society. What approaches to disability concerning work were found in the GDR, and to what extent was disability problematized there? To what extent did work and performance play a role? The GDR was a state that referred to Marxism and the traditions of the German labor movement. The following section will therefore briefly outline the extent to which disability and work were mentioned, theorized, and problematized in Marx's work and in the German socialist, social democratic, and communist movement. In addition, the origin of the so-called Sozialistisches Leistungsprinzip, socialist performance principle, and the concept of labor. Don't mention this anymore because I have to shorten the presentation. Okay. At the beginning of my many publications in the GDR, a party resolution of the Socialist Unity Party or socialist humanism is quoted. But even if the GDR saw itself as Marxist, the references to Marx are usually rather marginal in contemporary rehabilitation science writings. This is perhaps also due to the fact that the term Behinderung, or in English disability, had a different meaning in Karl Marx's time. Even though the term Menschen mit Behinderung, people with disabilities, has now become established in Germany, this was not necessarily the case in the GDR. Rather, different terms were used in parallel at the time, including Behinderte, disabled, but the term used in legal text from the 1960s onwards was Geschädigte. You can translate it as damaged. During Karl Marx's lifetime, the group of people with disabilities was not yet subsumed under a common term as it is today, which is why Marx did not make any specific comments on this group. However, as Stephen Bengtson has shown, his writings can be used to establish references to his idea of the body and performance, and also to the way in which groups that today would be categorized under the term people with disabilities were dealt with. Karl Marx assumed certain cognitive and physical abilities of man in order to distinguish human labor from that of animals. And in Marx's work, capitalism also damages workers' health to such an extent that they often became unemployed or even unable to work. These ideas also had an impact on ideas in the GDR. Karl Poor sees the tradition of the 19th century socialist labor movement continuing in the images of disabled people in the GDR. In her view, there were two competing models. On the one hand, the description of the plight of the working population, also and especially on the basis of disability and illness. And on the other, the image of workers as strong, manly, and healthy heroes fighting for socialism. Images of the disabled body were therefore particularly undesirable in socialist realism. However, there are exceptions to this, in which people with disabilities are also described as heroes of reconstruction. In 2017, Rebecca Maskos, a representative of German disability studies, explained that her understanding of an inclusive society is based on a change in the majority society and not on an adoption of minorities. He referred to a maxim that Karl Marx developed for a liberated society, for an inclusive society. In Marx's critique of the Gotha program, he stated, quotation, "In a higher phase of communist society, the motto could apply from each according to his ability to each according to his needs." End of quotation. Marx said that in the first phase, however, the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities. The satisfaction of needs depended on the labor performed. Quotation, "A given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form." End of quotation. Marx realized that this principle was not necessarily fair and would lead to an unequal distribution of wealth. labor had to be determined by an equal standard, be it in terms of extent or intensity. Quotation. This equal right is an unequal right for unequal labor. It recognizes no class differences, because everyone is only a worker like everyone else, but it tacitly recognizes unequal individual endowment, and thus productive capacity, as a natural privilege. It is therefore a right of inequality in its content, like every right. End of quotation. From his point of view, however, these defects were inevitable because they were still remnants of capitalist society. To compensate for the unequal distribution of wealth in the first phase of communist society, he envisaged, among other things, a fund for those unable to work. Marx thus assumed that a transitional phase would be necessary before communist society could become a reality. Overall, Marx's idea can be seen as problematic in terms of their consequences in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. They were not necessarily the cause of the performance orientation there, but served as justifications for the conditions and the performance principle in force there. In the Soviet Union and subsequently also in the GDR, the slogan was changed to each according to his ability, to each according to his performance. The realization of the socialist performance principle should be enforced through incentive wages. This slogan twisted Marx's guiding principle because the needs of the people were no longer mentioned here. What did this focus on performance mean for people with disabilities in the GDR? Unfortunately, it is not possible for me to present the disability policy in the GDR here. However, an important turning point was that, in addition to the quota for companies that traditionally apply to people with disabilities in Germany, the so-called geschützte Arbeit, sheltered employment, emerged in the 1960s. This was intended to benefit in particular people with severe physical disabilities and people with learning difficulties, who were considered to be underperforming. The term geschützte Arbeit, or in English sheltered employment, was translated directly from English and was not commonly used in West Germany. A definition by the International Society for Rehabilitation of the Disabled was discussed, although it was not adopted verbatim. In 1966, labor economist Joachim Walter praised the British workshop system, Rimploy, and held it up as a model in comparison to West Germany. The establishment of sheltered workplaces, which were set up both within enterprises and in special institutions like sheltered workshops, created jobs under special conditions. This was legally enshrined in 1969. Then the high organizational and care efforts were seen as obstacles to employment. Incentives were created to encourage businesses to establish these positions. This was particularly feasible through employment outside of the labor plan, allowing affected individuals to be employed as additional labor starting in 1969. The GDR was characterized by a performance ideology. I would like to briefly illustrate this based on remuneration and workplace practices concerning sheltered work employment. For incentive wages, performance pay, a specific norm was established that employees were expected to meet and according to which the pay was determined. This performance pay was only restricted by the minimum wage, which was set based on monthly salaries. These incentive wages also apply to disabled individuals. The frequently encountered claim that disabled individuals receive the same wages in the GDR must be critically evaluated. The same criteria for remuneration applied to them, at least until 1969. A lower performance capacity in performance wages also led to lower wages, making it frequently impossible for them to achieve the same wages as non-disabled persons working in the same profession and establishment. Moreover, there were often cases of acquired disabilities following an accident or illness necessitating a different job, often associated with lower qualifications and wages. However, a minimum wage existed in the GDR, which limited performance pay. From the 1960s, as the Ministry of Health made efforts to involve significantly impaired individuals in work, it actively sought to undermine the minimum wage. This was achieved by the 1969 Anordnung zur Sicherung des Rechts auf Arbeit Directive on Securing the Right to Work. This directive abolished the minimum wage for sheltered jobs and also added a performance component to time wages. The performance capacity of affected workers was to be assessed by doctors based on their past performances. Here, doctors ultimately had a significant leeway. The aim of the strongly performance-oriented remuneration was also to avoid imposing additional burdens on enterprises and to encourage them to employ disabled individuals. Therefore, wages in sheltered employment could be significantly below the minimum wage even for full-time employment. Disability pensions could be paid as compensations, though this did not apply in all cases. However, the minimum wage still applied for those disabled individuals not employed in sheltered work. The special treatment was even more pronounced in psychiatric institutions and confessional facilities, where individuals with learning difficulties were employed in their occupational therapy program, often for life, but were only paid a pocket money of a maximum of 60 marks. The perceived or actual underperformance of individuals with disabilities was relevant for businesses as well. While businesses in the GDR were not profit-oriented, they were strongly focused on output, namely fulfilling or exceeding their planned quotas. Here, underperformance could also be a hindrance. The alleged lack of performance capacity was repeatedly problematized. However, the solution primarily consisted of reducing wages accordingly or providing the businesses with compensation in other ways, rather than dismantling barriers. The emphasis on equal rights and the equality of all citizens in the GDR was simultaneously limited with a logic of performance that financially disadvantaged disabled individuals, even though they were socially secret, with the incentives. From the perspective of disability history, disability constituted a stress test for the socialist logic of performance. Although this was not to be jeopardized, the subordinate position of disabled people posed a problem for the equality logic of socialism, as poor treatment directly questioned the promise of equality. Disability was repeatedly problematized in the GDR. However, the inadequate provisions of jobs intended to be solved through sheltered work were also significant problematizations. The GDR had a social problem centered around disability people as disabled people that needed resolution in this idea. Konrad Jarausch proposed the term welfare dictatorship to characterize the GDR, emphasizing the social claims while also incorporating the patronizing character of social policy and clearly marking the GDR as a dictatorship. In relation to disability, the concept of welfare with its paternalistic undertone is convincing. Following Theodor Mladenov, these are medical productivist complex during state socialism, I would like to speak of a productivist welfare dictatorship to emphasize the performance and output orientation of the GDR economy. When it is said that the GDR was not a meritocracy because a large part of the workforce could easily meet the performance norms, one is once again starting from an average and overlooking what this meant for those who could not meet these performance demands. Further research should be conducted to more thoroughly illuminate the questions of what performance ultimately played in daily life in the GDR as demanded. For example, by Nina Mackert in the concept of critical ability history. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bertold. So I want to just apologize, everyone. I hastily skipped the break between Luke and Bertold's talk. So let's just take a brief, about a 5-minute break, and then we will reconvene, and hopefully Shu Wan's presentation will be ready to go. We have a couple technical issues that are happening in the background. So why don't we take a break? Unfortunately, we're in Canadian time. In Atlantic Canadian time, it's 3:15 p.m. So let's reconvene in 5 minutes at 20 after the hour. So please stick around, and you can feel free to take a break. Welcome back, everyone. Just to let everyone know, we've been having pretty significant technical issues. Shu Wan is at the University of Buffalo, obviously on the other side of the pond, and there could be a variety of reasons why the internet, we are getting glitches of the internet coming through and not, and now correspondence has been delayed, to say the least. So just to be safe, what we thought we would do is we would go into the question and answer, and so we can actually continue this dialogue and discussion around Cuba and the GDR. Just before we get into that, I would just like to do a reminder that these proceedings are being recorded. So if anyone wouldn't like to be on camera, please feel to just pause your camera on whatever device you're using, turn it off, and feel free. There's 2 ways that you can pose a question. One, you can either raise your hand. So at the bottom of the screen, you can touch the react button and then press on raise hand question, and I will try to call on you in order. And if you're not up for that, please feel free just to type the question into the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor the chat and attend to those accordingly. So with that, I would welcome people to begin asking our presenters a question or two.
Jim, just while folk are mulling those over, would I be all right to ask Bertold a couple of questions?
Of course, I'm delighted.
Fantastic. Okay, Bertold. So firstly, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, even more than last time. I have one question around the kind of strict interpretation of Marx's Goethe program as referring to physical ability. And I have another one on why the productivity norms were necessary in the data era. So firstly, on my reading of the Goethe program, Marx is not only talking about physical abilities as being determinative of labor output, but he uses a broader term Fähigkeiten, right, which equally includes kind of talent, skills, what have you, and matching somebody's Fähigkeit to their work and labor productivity assumes a movement, a free movement of labor within a socialist society, i.e., I might be crap at accounting, but I'm pretty good at making coffee, right? So you need a system wherein I can be shifted from the accountancy firm to the coffee shop in order to make most effective use of me. It seems that in the East German system, sheltered employment actually directly limited the mobility of labor. So was there any debate within the SED about whether there should be a widening of the potential jobs that disabled East Germans could do in reference to their broader productivity? Secondly, what were the debates justifying the productivity norm, and to what extent were they integrated into broader questions of socialist construction? Were the planners in the SAD insisting on a certain level of productivity because you needed to have outflows of goods and materials to other nations within the Warsaw Bloc? Was it in relation to direct competition with West Germany and the broader West European market? Or was there some other reason why state planners thought that they needed to enforce this norm and not, say, another one, or to allow local firms and industries to manage productivity norms for themselves?
I hope I can. I don't forget any of the question, but okay. With Marx's critique at the Gotha program, yes, I think I have the. I think I agree with you, because I think what happened in the GDR is, well, it was made different. It is not that was Marx said. It is was really yeah, only focused on performance, which is not mentioned in this chapter, in this. It's only they took this slogan and that they put the performance in. Yeah, I think the problem is probably that you can interpret Marx in such a way, but I would say it was not the idea that Marx had as he wrote this. It's okay. Probably this is all the problem with state communist societies in the GDR and Soviet Union, that with this performance principle, and although of course with other Stalinist things, they really that had not much to do with communist or socialist societies. Okay. Then why the GDR wanted this productivity logic? I think first thing is that it came from the Soviet Union. And of course, there were always, the Soviet Union was the leader of the Warsaw Pact, and that had an orientation to the Soviet Union. But the other thing is that there was always a problem in the GDR that there was not much enough products, enough wealth. They always compared to West Germany, and West Germany was always better economically. And they tried hard to get better, and they tried these performance wages. They also had, of course, other things to get a higher production, but they never reached. So, but they always had this comparison between the West Germany and the GDR. They always looked to West Germany because although there was a wall and a fence and so on, there were televisions and it was the same language. So many people saw West Germany in TV. That all the publicity and all these great things which you can buy, and you get into a shop and there was nothing. Not nothing, but not so much. Of course, it was not, there was no hunger or something like this in GDR, but so I think they tried hard to get more production. No, that's the truth. But the efforts were not so good. So now I forgot something.
No, you've got me covered. You've got me covered. I'm just always slightly amazed, and I'll shut up in a second, but I'm always slightly amazed when German speakers do those kinds of distortions of Marx. I mean, I can kind of forgive English speakers because the translations are bad. However, yeah, when you see that shift from Fähigkeit to Leistung in the language that it's originally written, I'm always a bit like, huh, you know what I mean? How do you get away with that one?
Yeah, it's sad, I would say. And this is also that was what I wanted to outline. That is there's a shift, and it's a bit tragic, probably. And of course, there was they tried with this sheltered employment. They tried to get more people into work. So people with learning difficulties traditionally lived in this great institutions, like I think also in the Great Britain or elsewhere with great sleeping dormitories and so on. And this was also the case in the GDR. So probably not, and also till the end. They tried to change it, but there was not much resources. This was not so important to change it really, and there was not so much money. So these dormitories stayed till the end, but they tried a bit to change it, and they tried to get more people with learning difficulties into work in enterprises, but also in these sheltered workshops, you can say. And this was the case in the 60s. In the 50s, they had much more focus on we get everything done. So in a few years, the problem of employment of disabled people is gone. So there was this hope that the solution is near only a few years ago, but they had also the focus on only physical disabled people. And then they get in the 60s, they get this international rehabilitation discourse, I would say. And they saw, okay, we have also people with learning difficulties. That's right. We have also to integrate them somehow. And they try to deal with it. And then they introduced this sheltered employment system.
So that's really interesting. Sorry, sorry, Chair. I will shut up.
No, there's no need to apologize whatsoever. This is wonderful. If there aren't other questions, let's just make sure that there's a open invitation to everyone. And again, if you would rather post your question in the chat, please feel free to do so.
So I've just realized that a question has been sent through, Jim, but it's been sent through to me.
Thank you, Luke.
So if with your leave, I'll just read that out and then we can respond to it. So one member of the network was wondering whether there was any info in the Cuba report about the perspectives of disabled members of mass organizations mobilized to address the issues experienced by the DPOs. And there's a question for both of us, Bertold, which is whether either of us can share our thoughts on how these experiences can be relevant to the struggles of current socialist governments who are trying to overcome similar or parallel problems. If I just go and get the first one answered, and then we can move on to the second one for both of us. So most of the people who were in ACLFIM were also in their local committees for the defense of the revolution. And reading between the lines of the report, it seems that they were trying to recruit other disabled members through the CDRs. So in Havana, at least according to the reports, the average membership of a committee for the defense of the revolution within a housing block would be about 80% of that housing block. So there were a number of disabled folk mobilized in the CDRs who were not necessarily ACLFIM members, and ACLFIM was trying to recruit them. There is not a differentiation in the report when it comes to, here are all the people that we've met, here were the ones who were ACLFIM members, and here are the ones who weren't. I mean, it's stated at the outset, we talked about 60, 70 people, both within and outside of the DPO we were working with. But there isn't a breakdown of who was in what. So we don't have a kind of independent statement of here's why I'm in my local CDR, but I haven't joined ACLFIM, if that's the kind of thing that you're asking for, mate. So I can't go much further than that. The only interesting thing that jumps off from this is that there are a number of statements, and it kind of shocked the British delegation, that CDR members did not see the need for independent providers of personal services. So people would say, the British delegation would ask, you don't seem to have PAs, right? Or there don't seem to be ramps in your apartment block. Aren't you worried about this? And folk would go, no, it's not a problem, because members of the CDR will just carry me up the stairs. Or if I need support with personal care in the morning, my neighbor, the CDR will organize for one of my neighbors to come and do it. And that's fine. And the British guys were really kind of taken aback by this, because it seemed like it was dependency creating. And they eventually kind of came to the view of, we're not sure we're comfortable with this, but also we haven't been through a revolution. Like, we live in an individualist society where you feel that someone helping you bathe first thing in the morning should be someone that you have the power of giving a wage to or withholding a wage from. And once you've been in a revolution against the wage system itself, you may well feel differently about that. And, you see coming up in the report that it's something that they recognize as legitimately rooted in the Cuban experience, but something that they can't quite get their heads around feeling comfortable with. So I hope that that's some level of clarification on that. On the second question, what does this mean for struggles of potential socialist governments today? Bertolt, do you want to jump off on that?
Okay, I hope I understood the question right. So in the GDR, there were mass organizations, different mass organizations, and there were also 2 organizations or 3 organizations for people with disabilities. And there were one which for blind and visual, one for blind and visually impaired people, and one for deaf and hard of hearing people. They were the only allowed organization. There was one, the so-called Deutsche Versehrtensportverband, which was a Sportverband, sport organization association. And but the GDR was a dictatorship, so they could not really make a scandal or something like this. They were, I think you can say, they were lobby organizations a bit. They tried to change things, and they wrote letters or at meetings pointed problems, and that you have to make it better. They always pointed on West Germany, though the organization for the blind, that in Germany they introduced our blind money, so probably we can also have it because, and they get it. Sometimes they had efforts, of course, and they get things better, and there was also something you can say service. They had the mass organization had you can say it's peer support, and they had they could give some things like technical support also. That was also organized about these organizations. But on the other side, physically disabled people never reached to get an association. That was forbidden, so they denied it. They didn't want it, and they had fear, really, that they get an organization because they thought it could be. It's not really clear, but at first time there was the thing with soldiers who were injured in the Second World War, and they could be Nazis and could be probably a political problem. So that's what the thinking. And the other thing that they probably don't focus on rehabilitation. This was the other argument, because they don't focus on rehabilitation. This is not good. They're only mourning or things like that, and we don't want this. Yeah, but of course, there were places which where disabled people can also meet later on, the so-called clubs where they could meet, and which were organized by other mass organizations like the Volkswohlfahrt or other organizations.
Just to tail off, just on the second part of the question, you know, what relevance can we draw from this for potential socialist governments today? I mean, I'm going to start by just being miserable. I don't see that many. I think, you know, you can make a case that Cuba maintains an attempt at socialist construction under bloody difficult circumstances. I don't think you can make that case for China or Vietnam or Laos anymore. I think there's, you know, these are state capitalist of one form or another. I think the key question for me in terms of a broader socialist project, not necessarily a broader socialist government, is in trying to conceptualize and think strategically about the role that stratification plays in the projects of our opponents, right? The role that it plays in class struggle as it exists, but also what an elimination of oppressive stratification would look like. The critique of the UPIAS comrades was not that, you know, Cuba was not trying to eliminate disability oppression. It very clearly was. It wasn't a critique that, you know, people's values were in the wrong place or people were acting opportunistically. It was actually, if you don't sit down and think really strategically about where you want to get to and how you get there in dismantling oppressive social relations, you are going to end up under the pressures that socialist construction is always put under, in a situation where it's always playing second fiddle to something else. And you are kind of creating path dependency for yourself. You are creating segregated institutions because that's the most efficient way to meet the needs of the national projects that you have. They are accepted by the oppressed because they're a damn sight better than what was there beforehand. However, once they are there, once they are integrated into the system of social mobilization, it becomes disruptive and potentially dangerous to dismantle them wholesale. So I think the argument is, and this comes down to us as socialists and revolutionaries, right, is to have integrated into our programs, our strategies, our conception of what the revolution is, the steps that can be taken to give people greater autonomy over their own lives at the start of the revolutionary process, rather than seeing that as something which happens further down the line when we've abolished the value form or something like that. Because it turns out abolishing the value form doesn't get you there by itself.
One thing I think when I see on the GDR, I would say you can see that how important a disability movement from disabled people is, because it was not possible to form such a movement in the GDR. There was also a lack of some slogans which were in the 80s in West Germany very important. Of course, the experts in the GDR, they knew about these movements. They knew, but they were experts and not really conform with them. And it couldn't be said only probably in church environment where the opposition in the GDR was mainly organized in the church. So this is because this was the only mass organization, you can say, where you could speak a bit freer. And so there was something like opposition, but there was not a movement, and so it was not possible to take this new human rights approach. It was difficult to. I think it's really a good explanation why it is important movement to have a movement from disabled people themselves.
Thank you very much, both of you. We do have a question from the audience. Ariana, please feel free to ask your question.
Thanks so much, Jim, for the great sharing, and Pete and Bertold, and you for the two wonderful presentations. Yeah, so I think I have many questions, but foggy brain at this time. So pardon me if my question doesn't make sense, and feel free just to respond in any way you can or ignore it. So I think from both of your presentations, I've been commenting also in the discussion now. It was really interesting for me to see how in very different contexts from the ones in which we are in, right, liberalism, so proceed, especially with social policy around performance that culminate in war and discrimination, but also the death of disabled people. So in two very different contexts, similar issues arise, but also, of course, in different contexts. So my question is for Bertold, whether there was any space for this poor performance, let's say, by disabled people within vis-a-vis disabled workers, if this at any point was something around which disabled people's movement, the disabled people's movement could unite around to repossess that bail-in, so as to create an alternative, even just at the level of narrative or alternative social circles. I don't know whether at any point there was if there was any space for that. And similar, Luke, you've ended your contribution just a second ago around how even in Cuba the rule of the value form still defined inequalities and their perpetuation. So again, my question is whether there was any space for for actually disabled people to work towards different horizons beyond and against the value form, in a way. Whether there was scope for thinking that just based on the two very different contexts that Bertold and Luke you've been talking about. So my question is, okay, there were those barriers, but was there more scope for thinking beyond the value form in those? Yes, thanks.
I'll jump in and go first. So I would argue that ACLFIM and the organizations of blind and deaf people, as at least they're presented in what I've read, were trying to think beyond the value form simply in their mode of engagement with the project of socialist construction. The idea fundamentally was to try and decommodify as much of the Cuban economy and Cuban society as possible, which is why you end up with attempts to run, insofar as is possible, distribution of aids and adaptations without costs attached to them, or with very minimal costs attached to them, based entirely around principles of need, right? So who needs this, their house adapted, who needs this aid or adaptation in order to continue the life they want to lead, who is unable to reproduce this in other ways. So there is an attempt to get beyond the value form in that, and insofar as the Cuban economy was increasingly decommodified, or reducing the level at which exchange and reciprocity relied on commodification processes, then they were directly involved with that stuff. So I do think that was in the thought process, right? And you can see that when in the presentation, I talked about their description of the Cuban economy as being primarily built around the production of use value rather than the production of exchange value. Now, it is absolutely true, and everyone accepted, that Cuba still existed within a capitalist world order, wherein, because it was indebted, it had to produce things that could be commodified in order to pay back its debts. And similarly, insofar as it needed to build up its defense capacities, it would need to engage in some form of international trade where you're paying cash for guns and stuff. And also, because they're a tiny island and you can't meaningfully create everything you need there needed to be some kind of trade system. So it strikes me that the Disabled People's Movement in Cuba was very aware of the both the desire to decommodify society and remove the value form, but also its external imposition on it. And they were very aware of that kind of a tightrope. I think the question is kind of a different one in the Cuban case, which is, okay, what falls outside of the value form contradiction, at least in its purest form? What kinds of oppression and stratification can survive even if you go through a thorough process of decommodification? And that's what the British comrades were trying to point out, that actually there were forms of oppression which could, rooted in capitalism, they arose because of the imposition of capitalist production onto Cuba, and its underdevelopment in particular, but actually have managed to survive and reproduce itself through processes of decommodification. So that's the kind of that's where they landed there, and I hope that's clarifying. Bertold?
I found it very astonishing that there was so much, though not much resistance, or the performance political was not really officially in these papers which I read, not really criticized. There were some people also from church, probably, and I'm not an expert in opposition literature. Probably there's much more about it. So I can't say this. It's a bit the problem, but on the official ground, newspapers and all of these rehabilitation, of course, there's always also mentioned, yeah, we have also to serve for the not so the disabled people and socialist humanism, and though we have to care about them, but it's really very comparable to the things which is in the welfare state in Western society. So in this case, but there were, of course, in the society in the GDR were many niches, which you had to work. It was you had to work, but often there were niches where you can go or work, and it was not so difficult. And there are also examples. A very well-known example is well, you can say a collective or a commune from disabled people who lived on a, it was an old building from the church somewhere really far away in Thuringia. And but they get from the state pensions, invalidity pensions. There were young people. And there were also other oppositional young people who didn't want to work. And they go to this place and they could live from this invalidity pension because, it was cheap to live in the GDR if you only want to eat something or live something. It was not expensive. So you could live with this invalidity pension. It was something like a personal assistant. Yeah, they take care of the disabled people, help them, but were happy not to not go to work in this in an enterprise also. So these niches existed, and there were also many concerts and also, of course, discussions about another society. And I think they were also very critical about this, forms of validation and so on. But I didn't make research about it in depth. In depth.
Thank you both for those responses to Ariana's question. We do have a question in the chat from Joe. This is pointed to both. I'll just read it verbatim. Do you think there are any methods / lessons to be learned from actual existing socialist countries that can be applied to our revolutionary organizations within the capitalist regime? For example, do you think we would be able to change backward societal views like ableism from the bottom up, rather than these changes being stimulated from the top down, like in Cuba / GDR?
Maybe a kickoff. So I'm going to take this as being limited to the question of disability liberation, as opposed to a broader one of relitigating the legacy of actually existing socialism. So in this instance, I think yes, there is. I would quibble slightly and say I don't think in the Cuban case it was an attempt to change views from the top down, although there was a place for the central state to intervene, right? So effectively, the example that sticks out in my mind from the report is ACLFIM said, hey, look, we have a member whose boss is saying that cripples aren't employable, right? And he's come to us and we've tried to negotiate with the boss, and the boss is stonewalling. So we've gone and got the head of Havana's Communist Party branch, and he's come in and said, look, if you want to remain the boss of here for much longer, you need to let this guy go and have a job. So there was that coercive element. However, in terms of managing contradictions around social views in most instances, that was done through grassroots membership organizations, whether those be the CDR or ACLFIM or one of the others. I do actually think that mass mobilizations are where you solve questions of ideology, not because you necessarily go and, beat your program into somebody's head and teach them the right views, but because if you have to go and work with people from a different race, a different religion, a different whatever, people with different physical functions, and you kind of have to be in a room with them every Thursday, you're going to work out a way to kind of live alongside them, and it's going to stop being the exception. It's going to be harder to maintain the more ridiculous of the social prejudices that people have simply by virtue of contact. So I think that's a really valuable lesson. I think it's also a valuable lesson that devolving administrative power over policies which affect people directly to those people is actually more efficient and more effective than we give it credit for. You could point to very serious gains for people with physical and sensory impairments in the Cuban system, which, given the amount of resources we put into it, were much, much more impressive than the very minor transformations that were being achieved with much greater levels of funding in Western Germany and the UK and the US during the same period. So I think that is a demonstrative lesson. Democracy is not just good because democracy is good. Democracy is also good because it tends to be more efficient.
I think it's an important point that you have to build it up from the bottom, because when I see the GDR society and also people who were dealing with problems and also with problems of ableism, they didn't say ableism, of course, they didn't say discrimination, but they also saw there were views about disabled people who are not so good, discriminate, and they always said, yeah, we have to make it ideologically, we have to argue. But I think because they were the representatives of a dysfunctional system, they were not very, the arguments were not so interesting for the most people. And the other thing is, that we have it would much better if the disabled people themselves had more to say. This is the one thing. The other thing is, I think we must think about performance, how performance or abilities play a role in a future society. And not only about disabled people, but also all people, how much should performance or such thing like abilities play a role in a future society? And I think we must think and discuss about this. Because the GR, which this performance principle, I think there was no way out of this performance society.
Thank you for your answers, mate. I like, Luke, your explanation of I hadn't really thought about society there being kind of desegregative. Like it's not quite so easy to just segregate disabled people away, and then it's much less easy to discriminate against someone when they're not out of sight, out of mind. I guess is something interesting I've not thought about. I was just thinking maybe my one like bugbear I always think about now in our like ongoing pandemic, but trying to implement any kind of a mask mandate, or basically try to implement any kind of masking in organizations or conferences or anything like that, which would allow disabled people to be there safely, allow everyone to be there safely. But one thing that seems to be without a mandate that's in place. So yeah, I guess top down, not saying it's authoritarian, but the organization itself kind of dictating that there's a law, there's a rule, like if you want to come in here, you have to abide by this rule that we want. Seems to be like the only way that anyone ever actually implements these things. And I don't know if that's just like of our individualist society that we live in under capitalism, that no one seems to care about that kind of thing. But it's just funny how, if you ask everyone to do the right thing on their own, personal opinion for it, that's how you get no one who wants to do the thing. But if you implement a mandate or something like this, it seems everyone kind of does that. And I don't know, I wonder if, just expanding it beyond, it's not masking just one particular thing, isn't it? This is kind of everything in society we're thinking of as well. But thank you for your answer.
Yeah, that was a great question too, Joe. An important question. Now we are at nearing the close, but I wanted to make sure if anyone wanted to ask a question prior to, we want to make sure there's times for announcements. Would anybody like to ask a question or type a question in the chat for the speakers? Well, I have to say, we apologize for Cuba not being able to present. We were finally able to get communication, and it took almost 40 minutes just for the emailed communication to get through. So we apologize to everyone for that. Hopefully, we'll be able to have Shu rejoin us in the near future. I absolutely want to thank Bertold and Luke for this. This was wonderful. I was thinking of Roddy Slork's 2024, the revised edition of his book, and how he attends near the end of the text to Martha's Vineyard, which for some of us is not a place where comrades want to necessarily speak highly of. But there's a beautiful discussion around critically rethinking disability within the context of a capitalist state. And it's so powerful and rewarding to hear people doing research, good research, on what's attempted or have tried or has been done in so-called socialist or attempting to be countries in transition. It's just so rewarding to hear this type of work being done. to get a rich response. So in response to Ariana and Joe's question, it was great hearing your work, and thank you for doing this and being a part of the June event. Before we go, there are a variety of announcements of events that are coming up, that are taking place. I just wanted to pass the floor to either Johanna or Luke to speak to events that are coming up.
Okay, I'll jump in and get mine out of the way. We've been approached by our comrades in the Disability and Migration Network. They are a group of disabled people working really hard on the injustices in the asylum migration system for disabled refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, what have you. If you are down in that there London, I pity you, but they will be having a joint conference with the London region of Disabled People Against Cuts on Saturday, the 28th of June. This will be in person, primarily because it's an organising conference and they need to be careful around security, and it's very difficult to do that online. But they would love to see MDN comrades in attendance to help them build a more inclusive, more militant disabled people's movement, which takes the question of racist disablism seriously and as a priority in our struggles moving forwards. I am putting a link to the conference in the chat. Yes, if anybody would like to go, I will also email this around. Please do register, contact the organisers, and they will be delighted to see you. Joanna has unfortunately can't come on camera or video at the moment. She's dealing with an unstable internet connection, seemingly we all are. But we would like to punt the joint Marxism Disability Network and Socio-Legal Studies Association conference, which will be taking place at the end of next week. It's entirely free. It's entirely online. We've got a really cool set of abstracts. It will go on for 2 afternoons, so the Friday afternoon and the Saturday morning through to early afternoon. Full BSL interpretation for anybody who needs that. Please check out the link. Please consider registering. We'd love to see you there. Thanks.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you, Luke, and Joanna for posting that. So if you want to see the links to both the points brought up, please see the chat, and you'll be able to gain access. And just as a heads up, there are a large number of registered participants for the conference, so it really would be worth following the links to make sure that you are able to access, because it sounds like it's going to be a banger, as the kids say. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this June event, and we look forward to seeing everyone as these continue through MDM. So with that, thank you all, and Bertold, Luke, and Shu, wherever you are, thank you for putting in all this heavy lifting so that we can benefit from your research and work.
Thank you very much.